All right, well, we're continuing on now in considering objections to utilitarianism and possible replies from utilitarians. The next objection I'd like to consider is the one that it's not possible to achieve happiness. And so if that's true, if it's true that human beings can't achieve happiness, then it seems like the goal of utilitarianism, which is to create as much happiness for the greatest number that one can, is impossible. Right? And then what would be the point of having that be the aim of an ethical theory? It must be misguided if its aim is impossible to achieve. Mill considers this objection, and many of you have actually read his text carefully here and summarized his account of this objection in his reply. So Mill writes in the text we read, against this doctrine, however, arises another class of objectors who say that happiness in any form cannot be the rational purpose of human life and action, because in the first place it is unattainable. Okay, so then Mill replies as follows. Mill thinks that it's false, that happiness is unattainable, but he says even if it were true that generating a lot of pleasure for anyone was impossible, we could at least diminish their pain. And that would be a good thing, right? Because currently many people are in a lot of pain, and it's clear that there are things that could be done that would diminish their pain immediately. If somebody's starving, giving them something to eat immediately diminishes their pain, right? If someone is sick, treating their illness immediately diminishes their pain, okay? So it seems like even if it's not, maybe for some crazy reason you think it's not possible to give anybody pleasure, but it certainly seems clear that you can diminish the pain of people. But then Mill goes on to say that if we consider this a matter of better and worse, as in people being in a more or less pleasurable state, right, and more or less a state of higher pleasure and lower pain, then it certainly seems possible that people can be more or less in that state. Maybe a perfect state of like all pleasure and no pain is not possible, but it seems pretty clear that people can be better or worse off as far as pleasure and pain are concerned, right? And it seems like a reasonable thing to try to achieve for people. And Mill gives a little bit more guidance here by, he starts out by saying that it's not that we want people to be in like a high pleasurable state all the time. Maybe that is impossible. But there are a lot of people that we could say are pretty content with their lives. And what that usually involves is some mixture of what he calls tranquility and excitement. So he kind of has in mind kind of going back and forth between these things, because you think about how these work. Tranquility is a kind of things being soft and calm and not too jarring and not too offensive or bothersome, right? You think about a really comfortable place to sleep as something tranquil, right? Well, that generates pleasure for people, that kind of tranquility. At the same time, though, if there's too much tranquility, or if the tranquility goes on for too long, then people get bored. So they also need excitement. And excitement is, you know, I don't know, think about roller coasters, or watching, you know, good entertaining movies, or reading difficult books and trying to make sense of them, or going on dates. That can be exciting, right? So there are a lot of things that you can do that are exciting that people can do, but too much excitement, if it was kind of like endless stimulation, endless challenges, you know, people get overwhelmed by that. It becomes frightening. It produces anxiety and so on. They need more tranquility. Okay, so Mill kind of describes this pattern of a happy human life as one that involves a kind of balance and a going back and forth between tranquility and excitement. And he says this is completely possible for people to achieve. And if you look at people who are pretty happy with their lives, he thinks their pattern of their life probably looks something like that. And there are many cases of people who are able to have that kind of pattern of life. And we could make that possible for more people. And then Mill also describes some causes of unhappiness. So here he's kind of pointing his finger at various features of the world and of individual people's lives that lead to them being unhappy. And part of the function of that is, if we can identify causes of people's unhappiness, then if we change those factors somehow, then it becomes possible to make people happier than they were before. So he describes, for instance, wretched social arrangements. He probably has in mind bad laws, bad organization of social policy that leads to people being unhappy. He describes selfishness, that if individual people have gotten into the habit of only caring about themselves, that habit, that pattern of life of just caring about oneself tends to lead to unhappiness for those individuals. And if you don't believe that's true, I encourage you to look closely at the people that who you would say are most selfish, and the people who are, let's say, most concerned with others, and ask yourself which group of people tends to be happier. And then finally, the want of mental cultivation, that people are not, they're not educated, or they don't become able to engage with the world in a way that allows them to see what really is interesting and exciting about it. So you think about how much joy comes from really understanding some fairly complex technical thing that you may be interested in. Think about like your hobbies. Maybe if you work on cars, or you love nature and you can identify different bird species, or you have worked in a laboratory for someone, or maybe you play music and you can, you know how to play a lot of songs and can learn new songs on whatever instruments you play. These things all involve a certain amount of cultivation of those skills to be able for a person to appreciate them. But once somebody has a cultivation of skills like that, they have a lot more reasons to love life. They have a lot more reasons to enjoy life and things to look forward to. And so Mill thinks one of the causes of unhappiness is that people are not given the tools to be able to enjoy life in those ways. And if we were able to help people to have those skills, then we'd be able to help people be happier than they are otherwise. And then finally, Mill also lists some other causes of unhappiness, like disease, objects of affection being lost prematurely. You think about people's, children passing away, things like that. Extreme poverty. This is something that's mentioned by Peter Singer as well. And doing a bad job of regulating one's own desires. So you think about like addiction, for instance, that can really make somebody very, very unhappy. But there are ways of addressing each of these issues. So again, the main point here is that even though the critic says happiness is unattainable, it just seems like if you look at the case honestly, it seems like there are lots of things that could be done to make people happier than they otherwise are, and to alleviate their suffering, to remove some of the pain in their lives. And so Mill has just sketched out some reasons why he thinks that's true, that it's possible to make people happier by identifying some of the causes of their unhappiness, and some of the kind of description of the target state and the kind of patterns that tend to lead to people living more pleasurable lives. So another objection that can be made to utilitarianism is about how utility itself is measured. And if you think about it, what we have in both Bentham and Mill is the claim that it's good to generate more pleasure in absence of pain. But we don't have a really clear metric or a really clear method for determining how much pleasure or pain someone is in. If you look again at the Lego men who served as my example that are at the top of the slide, I assign numbers to estimate their relative pleasure or pain in the scenario that I discussed. But how do we assign, how can we do anything like assign numbers to the quantity of someone's pleasure or pain? If you think about it for a minute, that's seems kind of hard to do, okay? Well, one option that we could do, now we can imagine anyway, is to use something like neural firing of pleasure centers in the brain, or brain chemistry, release of certain neurochemicals. You can think about like endorphins, for instance, or dopamine as measurements of utility, of pleasure. So that we can imagine that, but that's again going to be a little bit hard to put into practice. And certainly Mill and Bentham themselves didn't have a developed brain science where that could even be imaginable. So I'm just going to pass over that one for now. Another option is to measure in terms of preferences. And in fact, Mill refers to that in a kind of as an aside in a way, when he says that we have no way of determining even the greater quantity of pleasure and pain than no other way than looking at people's preferences. Okay, so this is usually the method that's used. One way that one can use this method is to treat the amount of money that people would be willing to pay for various things or give up for various things as a kind of proxy or stand-in for how much utility those things would generate for them. This is a place where utilitarian theory and economic theory can actually link up in a certain way. And there are a variety of ways that people have tried to do that. And Mill himself, as I think I mentioned, had published in economics. So there is a link between utilitarianism and economic thinking about values. But even if you don't use cash as a proxy, you can ask people about trade-offs. So you can say, for instance, which would you rather have, a new car or a new house? And how they rate those two things, which of those two things they say they would rather have, tells you how much relative utility each would give to them. And if you have 100 questions like that, then it allows you to do kinds of rankings among lots of different things. And so that, at least for the set of items that have been compared, or the set of options that have been compared, okay, tells you about their relative preferences for each of those options. And it tells you which of those preferences generate greater utility than others. So it's a little bit more work to go from there to actually assigning a number value to the utility generated by any option, but I think it's good enough that you can see we can start getting a system that allows us to say what actions generate more utility than others for some group of people. And then the final strategy of reply here is to say something like, look, we already have a pretty good idea of what kinds of things generate pleasure and pain. If someone looks unhappy and they say they're hungry and you give them a sandwich and they eat it, that clearly generated pleasure and reduced pain for that person. Likewise, if you step on a dog's foot and it yelps, you know that what you did put the dog in pain. You don't get confused and think maybe stepping on the foot generates pleasure for the dog, right? You know that because of the dog's reaction and the kind of action that you took, that it's more likely to be generating pain for the dog than pleasure, okay? So it's not that hard is basically this reply to the objection. It's not that hard to tell what kinds of things generate more or less pleasure or pain. And an estimate is better than nothing. So even if we sometimes get it wrong, it seems like we often get it right, maybe more often than not we get it right. And it's better for us to be aiming to do better than it is to just give up. So even if it's hard to measure utility, it might still be the best goal that we could choose to try to maximize. And it's not something that we have no possible information about at all. We can make estimates. We can do a better or worse job of getting at it. And then another objection that can be made is that there are problems with applying utilitarianism. And these are some problems that Mill himself considers elsewhere in his essay. We haven't read these passages where he considers these objections. There are basically two versions of this problem with application objections. So one is to say it's hard to calculate what the thing is that generates most utility in a given situation. It's hard to know which action generates the most utility. And the other application problem is that it's hard to follow the dictates of utilitarianism. So you might know what action generates the most utility, but it's just hard for human beings to bring themselves to act in that way. Okay, so let's consider each of these in turn. For the hard to calculate version of the objection, there are a couple of things that can be said, most of which, all of these Mill himself says. So we can calculate, for one thing, we can calculate in advance. Okay, it's not that we confront every situation that arises with no information about what kinds of actions generate utility, positive utility, and which kinds generate negative utility. Okay, so for instance, Mill's example is stealing. It's not like in any case of stealing we need to go back to the drawing board to the basics to find out whether stealing in general generates more pleasure or more pain overall. Okay, we're pretty confident that stealing and having stealing be a regular thing that people do in society is going to generate more pain than pleasure overall. It's going to disrupt the trading between individuals and trust between individuals, and it's overall going to be a bad thing. So we don't have to figure that out every time we look at a case of stealing and ask whether it's likely to generate more utility or less utility. Another thing we can do is we can make estimates. In fact, we kind of have to make estimates. And we have to make estimates in all kinds of decision making that we do. So just the fact that our calculations are based on estimates rather than perfect numbers, that shouldn't be alone a reason not to do it, right? Because again, every time we make a decision with incomplete knowledge, which is every decision we make really, we don't know for sure. We don't know for sure when we buy some new product that we want to use. We don't know for sure that product won't break. We don't know for sure that product will be compatible with the other things we want it to be compatible with, etc. Okay, so we often make estimates of how things will go, and our estimates are more or less accurate. We do a better and worse job of making estimates. So likewise here with calculating overall utility, we can make estimates and we can do a better and worse job. And if we pay attention to our methods and kind of develop our methods, we may get better and better at making estimates and thereby at making decisions that maximize positive utility. And then the final point is that we can trade off between the time and energy spent in calculating and the accuracy of the calculations. And in fact, utilitarianism recommends that we do that. So let me give you an example. Suppose that you are in a building that's caught on fire, and if you act now immediately, okay, then you can save 5 people's lives for sure. Okay. On the other hand, the plan that you have for saving those lives might not be the plan that saves the most people's lives. And if you spend 10 minutes deliberating, working out a better plan, you might be able to actually save 7 people's lives. Okay, so bumping up from 5 to 7, save 2 additional people's lives. But if you spend that 10 minutes calculating, then the fire will consume the rest of the building and you will save nobody's lives. Okay. Well, it's very clear in this case that utilitarianism would say, don't spend the extra time calculating. Just save people's lives right now. You can save 5 right now. That's better than 0. Okay. Even though your calculation isn't perfect because you're making it in a limited amount of time, spending any more time calculating will actually make things worse. So you should just act now and save the 5, okay? And if it were the case that by spending 1 minute calculating, you could save an additional person, say bump it up from 5 to 6, right? And you could actually still save all 6, and you know that when you enter into the calculations, then utilitarianism would say, do that. Spend a minute calculating and save a 6th person. Sure, that makes sense. So you sort of see, I hope you see how that works. The point is that whether we should spend more time calculating to find out what the best possible utilitarian action would be can itself be determined on utilitarian principles. And sometimes the energy spent and the time spent in calculating isn't worth the cost. And so we should just go with an approximation that is not the perfect answer, but is the best answer for the amount of time and energy that that we spend on getting the answer. And then finally, there's the claim that that utilitarianism is hard to adhere to. If you think about Peter Singer's argument that we all have a responsibility to give much more than we currently do to the alleviation of poverty around the world, and if we kind of apply the principle of utility to our charitable giving, for instance, and ask, are we giving enough to alleviate poverty? The answer would almost certainly be no, none of us are giving enough, okay? Now, one possible reply to that argument from Singer is to say, but it's just so hard for people to give more, right? Well, a good utilitarian reply to that is to say, look, the fact that it's hard to do doesn't mean that it's not the right thing to do, right? The fact that people's psychology kind of makes it hard for them to be moral is not an argument that that thing isn't moral, right? Another part of the objection that one can make here is that most ethical theories have the feature that people don't already automatically and easily adhere to them. If an ethical theory just told people to do what they already do anyway, then what would really be the point of it, right? Part of the point of an ethical theory should be to like help people know what they should be striving for and what's the highest mark that they could achieve, so that they can kind of know how to become better, right? If it just told them just do what you already do anyway, then it wouldn't be very useful. And then the final part of this objection is just that, well, it's kind of already covered in what I just said. It's better to approximate to a good ideal, even if even if none of us have ever been a perfect utilitarian and never will be. If the utilitarian ideal is a good one, then it's a good one for us to adopt and to try to approximate to try to get closer to, right? That's much better for us to have such an ideal and try to get closer to it than it would be for us to have no ideal at all, simply because the ideal is hard to achieve perfectly, right? So, okay, I think that's enough with this set of objections.